Hi, welcome to the Acheron tutorial video. Acheron is an experimental MIDI sequencer based on the harmonic table note layout inspired by the Mac app Elysium, itself inspired by the Reactagon from 2007. As a MIDI sequencer, it makes no sound on its own, so you'll need to connect it to a sound source of some kind. It's quite straightforward if you're using an external MIDI device, but if you're using a DAW or other plugin host running on your computer, which is probably the most common use case, you need to set up a MIDI loopback driver. On macOS, there's one built in called the IIC driver. On Windows, you need to install Loop MIDI, which is linked in the description. Alright, let's get started. Maximize. I like to zoom it out a bit. It can be kind of weird with aspect ratios other than 16:9. Why not go full screen? Yeah. Okay, so first off, you're going to want to click on Settings. Under MIDI Outputs, select your loopback driver or MIDI device. For now, I'm going to leave the settings like this. It's a good idea to turn off Play Notes on Click if you're using Acheron for a performance, otherwise it's nice to have on. I prefer working without prompts for deleting things, which can make things go a little bit faster. Wrap Playheads toggles whether going outside the grid deletes a playhead or wraps it around to the other side. Don't worry too much if that last sentence didn't make much sense. It will later on, I promise. Okay. Now it's time to get to know some tokens. There's a lot of settings on the left of the screen. Ignore those, we'll get to there later. Let's start with Generate. Right-click on a hexagon. Select Add Generate. Now press play. Look at her go. That's a playhead. Time for another token. Right-click a hex above the generator. Select Add Rebound. Now check out the settings on the right, specifically direction. This is how we move playheads around the grid, which doesn't really do anything yet. Let's place some note tokens now. There we go. Maybe a couple more. So now we have something, but it's kind of boring. Pretty soon we'll take a tour of all the different tokens and their parameters and see how much less boring we can make it. But before that, I should probably go over the global and layer settings on the left of the screen. Starting at the top, we have the key control. This allows you to set a scale to be highlighted on the grid, and also disables notes outside the scale from playing. Then we have Transpose, which allows you to shift the pitch of all notes up or down in semitones. tempo in beats per minute, then bar length, velocity, and emphasis. Velocity refers to the MIDI velocity of notes. Usually this controls volume. Bar length and emphasis work together. At the beginning of each bar, velocity is determined by the emphasis value instead of the velocity value. Then there's tempo sync and note length. If tempo sync is on, note length is measured in beats. If it's off, note length is measured in seconds. Then time to live and pulse every. These affect generator tokens. Time to live controls how many beats a playhead can travel before it disappears. Pulse every determines how often generators should create playheads measured in beats. Let's check the layer tab now. Notice that it's mostly the same as the global tab, except the drop-down boxes above most of the values are set to inherit. This means that they stay the same as the global version of that setting, even if it changes. You can change these to fixed to allow for different values on each layer, or even control them with an LFO. LFOs are low-frequency oscillators that allow you to modulate any parameter with one of several waveforms. Let's check it out. I'm going to modulate the transposition. Click Edit LFO. Now I've already got one programmed in here. Notice the type is sequence. This is pretty interesting compared to most of the others, which are pretty straightforward if you've ever seen an LFO before. Sequence simply plays back the series of values you input, however long that series may be, over the period of seconds that you specify. So that can be really powerful, especially if you use very long sequences or very long amounts of time. Okay, aside from that, there are two more parameters in the layer tab. Enabled, which simply turns the layer on or off, and MIDI channel, which allows you to play different instruments with different layers. You can add and switch between layers with the controls in the upper middle of the screen. Okay, now that that's out of the way, we can explore the tokens. Again, let's start with Generate. First we have Trigger Mode. By default, this is set to beat, which means it will generate a playhead each time the number of beats defined by the pulse every control passes. You can change this to impact, which generates a playhead each time a playhead passes through the token, or MIDI, which generates a token on receiving the MIDI note of the hex the token is on from any device selected in the MIDI section of the settings. Probability is simple, just a % value of how likely it is to run the token. Direction is pretty self-explanatory. Notice that time to live and pulse every are here as well, but are set to inherit by default. You can change that to fixed or LFO to allow for changes that affect individual tokens rather than the whole composition or layer. The offset control sets when in the cycle a playhead is produced. For example, if pulse every is 16 and offset is 1, a playhead will be generated on the second beat of a cycle of 16 rather than the first. Offset controls when in the cycle a playhead is produced. For example, if pulse every is 16 and offset is 1, a playhead will be generated on the second beat of a cycle of 16 rather than the first. Now the rebound token. Probability and direction are here, but there's also gate controls. This part might be a little confusing, but it's my favorite part of Acheron. Try setting gate on to 1 and gate off to 1. This means the token only runs every other time a playhead hits it. You could also, for example, set gate off to 3 and gate off to 1, which would result in the token being skipped the first 3 times it triggers and activating on the 4th, then looping. Gate offset could be set to 1, which would trigger the token first rather than last, or 2, which would trigger it second in a sequence of 4. Still with me? With the gate system, we can create branching paths and compositions that evolve over time, but in a pattern, maybe a very complex pattern, but not random unless you want it to be. And now the note token. You've seen this all before except the triad control. One cool feature of the harmonic table note layout is that any cluster of 3 notes creates a nice sounding chord. The triad control allows you to play one of these chords all at once from a single hex. Another thing to note is that you can stack multiple tokens on one hex, even of the same type. For example, you can add more than one note token to a hex and transpose them different amounts to create whatever chord you want. Okay, moving on. The absorb token. Okay, let's remove some of these notes that aren't playing and add in an absorb token. This deletes any playhead that crosses its path, which is particularly useful with the gate and probability controls. Okay, let's move the generator down here and add a skip token. The skip token instantly sends a playhead however many steps are specified ahead. This supports negative numbers to skip backwards also. Let's set it to 4. There we go. Okay, here's twist. Twist rotates the playhead by the amount specified. This way you can redirect playheads in different directions depending on the direction they came in from. Clockwise is positive, counterclockwise is negative. Okay, then we have the lifespan token, which increases or decreases the time to live of playheads that enter it. You can drag and drop, by the way. Shift drag copies, and it copies all the tokens with all their properties. Alright, split token. The split token sends a playhead in every direction except the one initially entered, unless bounce back is turned on, in which case it sends one that way too. For example, there we go. Okay, now we have randomized. This can send a playhead in a random direction, to a random location, or to a random layer, or any combination of the three. Okay. Now the wormhole. This one is kinda complicated. So this next part's adapted from the documentation. The wormhole token transports any playhead that enters its hex to the location of another wormhole token on the same channel. Note that this works between layers. You can create wormholes that don't interact with each other by specifying the channel to send and receive on. You can also turn off sync channel I/O to create wormholes that send on different channels than they receive. Send behavior determines where a playhead will be sent when there are multiple wormholes receiving on the same channel. By default, this is set to sequence, which cycles through wormholes in order of their priority setting. It can also be set to random. And that's basically it. Now I'm going to try to put it all together and make a composition. There you go. I could keep going. I probably will later. But that's how you do it. Thank you for watching. Bye.